On the morning of May 29, 2007, a foundry worker in Windsor, Ontario, watched the last engine block come off the line. No ceremony, no countdown. Just iron, cooling on a conveyor belt, in a building that had been burning hot since Franklin Roosevelt was in his first term. For 73 years, the furnaces inside Windsor Casting Plant never fully went dark. They ran through the Second World War, through the oil crisis, through recessions, restructurings, and every wave of doubt that crashed against the North American auto industry. The workers here had won Ford's highest quality award. They had earned international environmental certification. They had literally melted down the bones of a neighboring plant and turned them into engine blocks. Because that's what you do when you're built to last. None of it mattered. Because Ford Motor Company had made a decision. Not about quality, not about effort, not about Windsor, but about the future of manufacturing itself. They had decided they no longer needed to cast their own iron. 73 years, 500 jobs, 500,000 square feet of industry, gone. This is the story of the foundry that named a legend, and the day Ford's engine empire went silent. To understand why Windsor Casting Plant mattered, you first have to understand Windsor. Most Canadians think of Windsor as the city at the bottom of the map, the southernmost point in the country, tucked below the 49th parallel, sitting on the northern bank of the Detroit River. Look across the water and you see Detroit. Look down and you see the Ambassador Bridge. For most of the 20th century, that geography was not a curiosity. It was an economic lifeline. Windsor was not just near the automotive industry. Windsor was the automotive industry on the Canadian side. It started in 1904 when a local entrepreneur named Gordon McGregor struck a deal that would reshape southwestern Ontario forever. McGregor was the president of the Walkerville Wagon Works, a manufacturer of horse-drawn wagons that could see, clearly, which way the wind was blowing. He approached Henry Ford. He offered factory space, local labor, and access to the British Empire's preferential trade network. Ford offered his name and his patents. The result was Ford Motor Company of Canada, born in a converted wagon factory in Walkerville, a village that would eventually be absorbed into the city of Windsor. From the very first year, the Canadian operation punched above its weight. In 1904, the Walkerville plant produced 117 automobiles. Within a decade, Ford had outgrown its original building multiple times over. The factory expanded onto reclaimed land along the Detroit River. Finished vehicles had to be eased carefully down a steep ramp to reach the street. The roof of the main building carried a sign with 15-foot metal letters spelling out Ford Motor Company of Canada, stretching more than 450 feet across the facade, visible from across the river in Michigan. Windsor was not a branch plant. It was a headquarters, an identity, and eventually, a way of life. The community that grew up around the factory reflected that. Along Driard Road, the main artery of what locals called Ford City, a full economy emerged. Shops, restaurants, boarding houses, union halls, churches. More than 1,700 Ford of Canada workers gathered for a single photograph during the First World War, a number that tells you everything about how quickly this industry had taken root. By 1929, Ford City had a population of 16,000, 6 schools, and a fully developed municipal infrastructure. It renamed itself East Windsor. The wagon factory had become a civilization. And at the center of that civilization was the engine. In 1923, Ford opened the Windsor Engine Plant, the facility that would become the oldest continuously operating Ford property in Canada. It sat in downtown Windsor, on the bank of the same river that separated two countries and connected two industries. The engine plant was not an afterthought. It was the mechanical core of Ford's Canadian operation, the place where raw ambition was translated into rotating steel. For 11 years, the Windsor engine plant stood alone. On November 9, 1934, its neighbor arrived. Windsor Casting Plant, known internally as WCP, known to every Windsor resident simply as the Foundry, opened its doors beside the engine plant in the heart of downtown. It was not glamorous work. Foundry work never is. The heat was brutal, the noise was constant, and the material being handled? Molten iron poured into molds to form cylinder blocks, crankshafts, and cylinder heads, left no room for error. But foundry work was essential. Absolutely structurally essential. Here is something that rarely gets explained in stories about the auto industry. Before a single piston moves, before a single combustion occurs, before any engine does anything at all, someone has to cast the iron. The cylinder block that holds the entire engine together, the crankshaft that converts combustion into rotation, the cylinder head that seals the combustion chamber. None of these parts can be stamped or welded into existence. They have to be cast. Molten metal poured into a precision mold, cooled, extracted, and machined to tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch. Windsor Casting Plant was where that happened for Ford in Canada. Without WCP, the Windsor engine plant had nothing to assemble. Without WCP, the crankshafts that would eventually sit inside some of the most iconic engines in North American automotive history, the engines that would carry the names Mustang, Thunderbird, F-150, did not exist. The foundry was not support infrastructure. The foundry was the beginning of everything. By the mid-1930s, Windsor had what few industrial cities in Canada could claim: a complete, vertically integrated automotive ecosystem. Raw materials came in. Iron was melted and cast at WCP. Components moved to the engine plant. Finished engines moved to assembly. Finished vehicles moved to dealerships and driveways across the country. Ford had not just built a factory in Windsor. Ford had built a supply chain inside a single postal code. And for the families who worked inside it, the machinists, the pourers, the crane operators, the quality inspectors, Windsor Casting Plant was not a job. It was a career, passed from father to son, anchored to a city that had staked its entire identity on the idea that what was made here mattered. In 1934, with the ink barely dry on the opening papers, no one could have imagined it would last 73 years. No one could have imagined either how it would end. There is a detail about the Windsor Casting Plant that most people never knew. Not the workers who drove past it every morning, not the customers who bought the vehicles it helped build, and certainly not the millions of drivers across North America who pressed the accelerator and felt the engine respond beneath them. The name on that engine came from here, the Windsor V8. One of the most recognized engine designations in Ford's history, a family of overhead valve V8 engines that would power Ford vehicles for decades, earn a devoted following among mechanics and enthusiasts, and appear under the hoods of vehicles that became genuine cultural landmarks. The Windsor V8 was not named after a castle in England. It was not named after a marketing concept or a product committee. It was named after a mid-sized industrial city in southwestern Ontario, because that city, and the foundry and engine plant that sat at its center, was where the engine was born. Windsor Casting Plant and the adjacent Windsor Engine Plant were the original production home of the Windsor V8. The castings came from one building, the assembly happened next door, and the engine that carried the city's name went out into the world in vehicles that defined what North American driving looked and felt like for a generation. Consider what the Windsor V8 powered. The Ford Thunderbird, the two-seat personal luxury car that debuted in 1955 and immediately became a symbol of post-war American optimism. The Ford Mustang, launched in April 1964, selling more than 400,000 units in its first year, igniting the pony car segment and becoming one of the most iconic automobiles ever built. The Ford F-Series, the truck line that would eventually become the best-selling vehicle in Canada for 50 consecutive years. Mercury models, larger Ford sedans, fleet vehicles, police interceptors. All of them, at one point or another, carried iron that had been shaped in Windsor. This is not a minor historical footnote. This is the core of what made Windsor Casting Plant something more than a parts supplier. Every time a Mustang revved on a drag strip, every time a Thunderbird turned heads on a boulevard, every time an F-Series hauled a load across the prairies, Windsor was in that moment. Not visibly, not with any signage or branding that a driver would notice, but materially, physically, in the structure of the engine itself. The foundry was inside the legend. The post-war years were when Windsor felt this most acutely. The late 1940s and the 1950s were extraordinary decades for the North American auto industry, and Windsor rode that wave with everything it had. Returning veterans went back to work in the plants. Wages were strong. The union, the United Auto Workers, and its Canadian counterpart, had negotiated contracts that turned factory work into a genuine path to middle-class stability. You could buy a house in Windsor on a foundry worker's wages. You could raise a family, put children through school, retire with a pension. The Detroit River Corridor was, in those years, one of the most productive industrial strips on the planet. Detroit on one side, Windsor on the other. Between them, they were building the vehicles that were moving the continent. Windsor Casting Plant was running at full capacity. The furnaces were burning around the clock. The crankshafts coming off the line numbered in the millions, 2 million per year at the plant's height, across 7 different engine models, ranging from compact 4-cylinder units to the full V8s that gave the Windsor name its weight. And then the world changed. It did not change overnight. It rarely does. But in October 1973, the Organization of Arab Petroleum Exporting Countries announced an oil embargo against nations that had supported Israel in the Yom Kippur War. The United States was at the top of that list. Within weeks, gas prices in North America spiked. Lines formed at filling stations. Overnight, the large, heavy, fuel-hungry vehicles that Ford had been building and that Windsor had been supplying became liabilities. Consumers did not abandon V8 engines immediately. The cultural attachment ran too deep, and the infrastructure of the North American auto industry was too committed to large displacement power to pivot quickly. But the direction of travel was now clear. Smaller engines, better fuel economy. Japanese manufacturers, Toyota, Honda, Datsun, had been quietly building a reputation for reliability and efficiency that the domestic brands had consistently underestimated. By the late 1970s, that underestimation had become a crisis. Ford's sales volumes declined. Production schedules were cut. The demand for the castings and crankshafts coming out of Windsor began to fall. The foundry that had run hot for 45 years began to feel the cold. And in 1980, it stopped. For the first time since its opening in 1934, Windsor Casting Plant shut down. The furnaces went dark. The workers were laid off. The building that had never fully gone quiet fell silent. Windsor told itself it was temporary. Windsor was right, but only just. And the lesson it should have taken from 1980 was one the city would not fully absorb until it was too late. When Windsor Casting Plant closed in 1980, the city grieved the way industrial communities always grieve, quietly, and with the particular dignity of people who have spent their lives working with their hands and do not consider public despair an option. The layoffs hit without warning, in the way that layoffs always technically arrive with warning, but never feel like it. One week you are a foundry worker with a paycheck, a pension accruing, a shift that starts at the same time every morning. The next week, the furnaces are cold, and someone is explaining to you, in careful corporate language, that demand conditions have made your position untenable. Demand conditions. As if the problem were abstract, as if it had nothing to do with the fact that a cartel of oil-producing nations had restructured the global economy, and that North American automakers had spent 30 years building vehicles optimized for cheap gasoline, and that the bill had now come due. And the people paying it were the ones who had least to do with running it up. The 1973 oil crisis had not destroyed Windsor Casting Plant immediately. The industry had absorbed the initial shock, rationalized its way through the mid-1970s, and convinced itself that large displacement engines still had a future. Then, the Iranian Revolution of 1979 triggered a second oil shock. Gas prices spiked again. This time, consumers did not wait. They walked into dealerships and asked for something smaller, something Japanese, something that could make it to the end of the month on a single tank. Ford's response was too slow and too late. The company was still heavily committed to V8 production at a moment when V8 demand was collapsing. Plants running below capacity were costing money Ford could not afford to lose. The calculation was straightforward, even if the human consequences were not. Windsor Casting Plant was idled. For the workers who had built their lives around the foundry, some of them second-generation Ford employees, men whose fathers had poured iron in the same building, the closure was not simply an economic event. It was a rupture in the story they had been told about how the world worked. You showed up. You did the job. The job was there when you came back. That was the covenant. Ford had broken it. The CAW fought. The union always fought. But there is a limit to what collective bargaining can accomplish when the problem is not a contract dispute, but a fundamental shift in what people want to buy. Windsor waited. And then, against the odds, against the general direction of the industry, against every pessimistic forecast being written in business pages across the country, the furnaces came back on. Demand recovered. Not dramatically, not in a way that erased the lessons of the oil crisis, but sufficiently. Ford needed castings again. Windsor Casting Plant reopened. The workers came back. The crankshafts started moving. The city exhaled. What happened next is the part of the story that matters most. Not because it had a happy ending, but because of what Windsor chose to do with its second chance. Rather than treat the reopening as a return to normal, the people running Windsor Casting Plant treated it as a mandate to become indispensable. If the foundry was going to survive in a leaner, more competitive industry, it could not merely be adequate. It had to be exceptional. Through the 1980s, WCP invested in quality. It tightened its processes, reduced defect rates, and built a culture of precision that was genuinely unusual for a facility handling materials as elemental and unforgiving as molten iron. The work was still brutal. The heat was still relentless. But the standards were climbing. By 1989, those standards had attracted the attention of Ford's world headquarters in Dearborn, Michigan. That year, Windsor Casting Plant was awarded the Ford Q1 Award, the company's highest recognition for quality performance, given only to facilities that have been audited directly by Dearborn and found to meet Ford's most demanding standards for product quality, delivery performance, and service levels. Not every Ford plant earned Q1. Many tried and fell short. Windsor made it. For a foundry that had been shuttered less than a decade earlier, it was a remarkable turnaround, and a statement of intent. But here is the thing about excellence in a declining industry. Excellence keeps you alive longer. It does not change the direction of travel. The same forces that had closed Windsor Casting Plant in 1980 had not disappeared. They had merely paused. The Japanese automakers were not retreating. They were building factories on American soil, competing not just on imports, but on domestic production. Ford's market share, which had peaked in the mid-20th century, was in structural, long-term decline. The strategies that had built the company, large vehicles, large engines, vertical integration, in-house manufacturing of every major component, were all coming under pressure simultaneously. Windsor had survived 1980. It had come back stronger, but the industry it was coming back into was not the same industry it had left. And the decisions being made in boardrooms in Dearborn and Detroit were going to reach Windsor again. Not in a year, not in 5 years, but with the slow, grinding certainty of a structural shift that no amount of quality awards could stop. The foundry had earned its second life. The question was how long that life would last. There is a particular kind of institutional pride that develops in a workplace that has survived something it was not supposed to survive. It is quieter than ordinary pride, less celebratory, more resolute. The people who carry it do not talk about it constantly. They demonstrate it, in the way they do the job, in the standards they hold each other to, in the refusal to let the work be anything less than what it can be. Windsor Casting Plant had that pride after 1980. The closure had been a wound. The reopening had been a reprieve. And in the years that followed, WCP operated with the awareness, never fully spoken aloud but always present, that the reprieve was conditional. That the foundry existed in a world that did not owe it anything. That the only argument for its continued existence was the quality of what it produced. So they produced quality. Through the late 1980s and into the 1990s, Windsor Casting Plant built a record that was, by any objective measure, extraordinary for a facility of its type. The Q1 award in 1989 was the headline achievement, Ford's highest quality recognition, earned through a rigorous audit process conducted by Dearborn headquarters. But Q1 was not the end of the story. It was the beginning of a decade-long accumulation of evidence that this foundry, operating in a downtown Windsor building that some in the industry already considered outdated, was producing work that met and exceeded the standards of the modern automotive supply chain. In 1998, Windsor Casting Plant received ISO 14001 certification, the international standard for environmental management systems. ISO 14001 is not a marketing designation. It requires a facility to demonstrate that it has implemented systematic, verifiable processes for identifying its environmental impacts, setting measurable targets for improvement, and maintaining those improvements over time. For a foundry, an operation that by its nature involves high heat, significant energy consumption, and the handling of metals and alloys, achieving ISO 14001 was not a minor administrative exercise. It was a genuine operational transformation. The same year, WCP went further. When the neighboring Windsor Engine Plant No. 1, the original engine facility that had stood beside the foundry since before WCP itself existed, was demolished, Windsor Casting Plant took the scrap metal from the wreckage and fed it into its own furnaces. From the rubble of Windsor Engine No. 1, WCP cast 175,000 engine blocks. Pause on that for a moment. A foundry so committed to its own continuity that it literally melted down the bones of its demolished neighbor and turned them into new production. A building consuming another building. Industrial recycling as an act of institutional will. The old Windsor Engine Plant ceased to exist as a structure, but its iron lived on, reborn inside the engine blocks rolling off the WCP line. It was, in retrospect, one of the most quietly poetic moments in the history of Windsor's auto industry, and almost no one noticed. The following year, 1999, brought two more recognitions. The Canadian Council of Ministers of the Environment awarded WCP its Pollution Prevention Award for Large Business, a national recognition for outstanding environmental performance in a commercial or industrial context. In the same year, the plant received Ford's Powertrain Division Most Improved Award for safety performance in casting and forging operations. 2 awards, 12 months, covering the full spectrum of what a responsible industrial facility was supposed to be: clean, safe, and continuously improving. By the turn of the millennium, Windsor Casting Plant had assembled a record that should have made it untouchable: Q1 quality, ISO 14001 environmental certification, National Pollution Prevention recognition, Divisional Safety Improvement honors, 2 million crankshafts per year, 7 engine models supplied, one of the largest recyclers of iron and steel in all of southern Ontario. On paper, WCP was exactly what a modern manufacturing facility was supposed to look like. And yet, the auto industry does not reward historical performance. It rewards current economics. And the economics of in-house casting, of maintaining your own foundry, your own furnaces, your own specialized workforce, your own raw material supply chain, inside a downtown urban facility on expensive land, were becoming harder to justify with every passing year. The pressure was not coming from WCP's performance. The performance was exemplary. The pressure was coming from a structural shift in how the entire automotive industry thought about manufacturing, a shift that had been building quietly through the 1990s and would reach its full, destructive force in the decade that followed. The concept was called vertical integration, and Ford was about to abandon it. For most of the 20th century, the great North American automakers had operated on the assumption that control meant ownership. If you needed engine blocks, you built a foundry. If you needed transmissions, you built a transmission plant. If you needed stampings, you built a stamping facility. Every link in the chain was yours. The logic was straightforward. Ownership meant quality control, supply security, and the ability to coordinate production across the entire system. But ownership also meant cost. Fixed cost. The cost of maintaining buildings, equipment, and workforces regardless of whether demand was high or low. In a world of stable, predictable production volumes, those fixed costs were manageable. In a world of volatile demand, shrinking margins, and intensifying global competition, they were a liability. The alternative, outsourcing component manufacturing to specialized external suppliers, often in lower-cost jurisdictions, had been gaining credibility since the 1980s. By the late 1990s, it was becoming orthodoxy. The argument was simple. A foundry specialist could cast iron more cheaply than Ford could because that was all the foundry specialist did, and they did it at scale. And they did it in places where land and labor were less expensive than downtown Windsor, Ontario. Windsor Casting Plant was winning every award available to it. It was also becoming, in the cold language of corporate strategy, an anachronism. The workers at WCP could feel it, not in any single conversation or announcement, but in the texture of things, in the way investment decisions were made, in the way long-term planning discussions went quiet, in the way the question of the foundry's future sat in the room without anyone putting a name to it. They had earned everything a plant could earn. They were about to discover that it was not enough. In the mid-1990s, Ford Motor Company looked, from the outside, like a company in reasonable health. The SUV boom was underway. The Ford Explorer had become the best-selling SUV in North America, and the margins on trucks and sport utilities were significantly better than on passenger cars. The F-Series pickup was already cementing its position as the best-selling vehicle in Canada, a streak that would eventually reach 50 consecutive years. Ford's revenue numbers were strong. Its brand recognition was unassailable. If you had looked at the balance sheet in 1995 and asked whether this was a company with a serious problem, the honest answer would have been, not yet. But the SUV boom was doing something dangerous. It was masking the rot. Underneath the strong truck numbers, Ford's passenger car business was in structural decline. Market share, the percentage of total North American vehicle sales captured by Ford, had been eroding since the mid-1980s, and the erosion was not slowing. Toyota, Honda, and Nissan had spent 2 decades building reputations for reliability and efficiency that Ford's domestic competitors had consistently failed to match. Consumer report surveys, J.D. Power quality rankings, word of mouth in driveways and parking lots across the continent. The Japanese brands were winning on the metrics that actually moved purchase decisions, and Ford was losing ground, one customer at a time. The company responded with the wrong instincts. Rather than addressing the underlying quality gap in its core products, Ford leaned harder into the segments where it was still strong: trucks, SUVs, fleet sales, and hoped the tide would turn. It did not turn. It accelerated. By the early 2000s, the SUV market itself was becoming complicated. Fuel prices were rising again. Environmental concerns were entering the mainstream conversation. The vehicles that had carried Ford's profits through the late 1990s were starting to face scrutiny, not just from regulators and journalists, but from consumers who were beginning to do the arithmetic on what it cost to fill a tank twice a week. And then came 2005. Ford's North American automotive operations posted a loss of $1.6 billion. Not a disappointing quarter, not a one-time write-down. A $1.6 billion operating loss in the company's home market, the market it had dominated for most of a century. The number landed in Dearborn like a detonation. It confirmed what the internal data had been suggesting for years: that Ford's cost structure, its plant capacity, its manufacturing footprint, and its product lineup were all fundamentally misaligned with where the market had moved. Ford's plants were running at approximately 75% of capacity. In manufacturing, that number is not merely inefficient, it is unsustainable. Fixed costs do not scale down proportionally when volume drops. Running at 75% capacity still requires nearly the same heating, maintenance, security, and administrative overhead as a plant running at 100%. The difference goes straight to the loss column. Something had to be cut. A great deal of something. In Dearborn, a restructuring plan was being assembled under the leadership of Mark Fields, a senior Ford executive who would later become CEO, with input from Bill Ford, the great-grandson of Henry Ford, who was serving as the company's chairman and chief executive. The plan had a name that was either optimistic or tone-deaf, depending on your perspective. They called it the Way Forward. On January 23, 2006, Ford unveiled the Way Forward to the public. The announcement was one of the most significant in the company's modern history. 14 manufacturing facilities across North America would be closed by 2012. Between 25,000 and 30,000 hourly and salaried positions, more than 20% of Ford's North American workforce would be eliminated. Assembly capacity would be reduced by 26%. The company's officer ranks would be cut by 12%. The salaried workforce would shrink by 10%. Bill Ford stood in front of cameras and said, "We will be making painful sacrifices to protect Ford's heritage and secure our future." Among the 14 facilities named for closure was Windsor Casting Plant. The announcement was not a surprise to everyone in Windsor. The signals had been accumulating for long enough that people who were paying attention had already begun to prepare themselves emotionally, if not practically, for the possibility. But there is a difference between bracing for something and having it confirmed. The announcement made it real. The foundry that had survived 1980, that had earned Q1, that had recycled its neighbors' bones and cast them into engine blocks, that had won national environmental awards and divisional safety honors, was on the list. Ford's stated rationale was direct. The company had decided, as a matter of corporate strategy, to exit in-house casting operations entirely. Windsor Casting Plant was not being closed because it was underperforming. It was being closed because Ford had concluded that casting was not a business it needed to be in anymore. The same logic applied to Ford's Cleveland Casting Plant, which was also named for closure in the same period. 2 foundries, 2 cities. One strategic decision made in a boardroom far from either of them. The CAW, the Canadian Auto Workers Union, representing the hourly workforce at WCP, pushed back. Buzz Hargrove, the CAW's national president, was a veteran of auto industry battles who had spent decades fighting plant closures, negotiating contracts, and representing workers whose livelihoods were tied to decisions made by executives they would never meet. Hargrove was not a man who accepted corporate logic without scrutiny. But even Hargrove understood the arithmetic. Ford was losing billions. The way forward was not a negotiating position. It was a survival plan. The CAW could shape the terms of the closure, fight for the best possible severance packages, and protect as many workers as possible through the transition. What it could not do was reverse a strategic decision that Ford had already made and publicly committed to. The union told its members the truth. The foundry was closing. The fight now was about how and on what terms, and what Ford owed the people who had given it decades of their working lives. Windsor Casting Plant had 18 months left. The furnaces were still burning. The crankshafts were still moving. The workers were still showing up every morning, doing the job with the same precision they had always brought to it, because that was who they were, and because the work deserved it, regardless of what was coming. But the clock was running. There's a specific kind of grief that comes with knowing the end date. Most plant closures arrive with ambiguity. Rumors, denials, qualified statements from corporate communications departments trained to say nothing definitive until the last possible moment. Workers spend months in a state of suspended anxiety, unsure whether to start looking for other work, unsure whether to believe the union when it says it's fighting, unsure whether the announcement they dread is coming next week, or next year, or not at all. Windsor Casting Plant did not have that ambiguity. After January 2006, the date was known. The decision was public. The way forward had named WCP explicitly, and Ford was not in the habit of reversing announcements of that magnitude. The foundry was closing. The only questions were the terms. In some ways, knowing was worse. Every morning shift that started was one fewer morning shift remaining. Every crankshaft that came off the line was one closer to the last one. The building itself had not changed. The furnaces still burned at the same temperature. The conveyors still moved at the same speed. The quality standards were still being met with the same rigor that had earned WCP its awards. But the meaning of the work had shifted. It was no longer building towards something. It was counting down. The CAW and Ford negotiated through the first half of 2006 with the controlled urgency of 2 parties who understood that the outcome of the foundry's closure was already fixed, and that what remained to be determined was how much of the human cost could be absorbed, redirected, or mitigated. Buzz Hargrove, the CAW's national president, framed the negotiation honestly. The union had to accept Ford's decision to scale down its Ontario operations in order to shape a contract that protected workers across the broader Ford Canada system. Sacrifice one position to defend many others. It was not a comfortable calculation, but it was a real one. The resulting agreement was, by the standards of plant closure packages, substantial. Ford of Canada offered financial assistance packages worth up to 100,000 Canadian dollars per worker, a figure that reflected both the severity of the disruption and the pressure the CAW had applied at the bargaining table. Workers who were eligible for retirement could take an incentive package and leave with their pension intact. Workers who were not yet retirement age had options: transfer to Ford's Oakville Assembly Complex, transfer to the St. Thomas Assembly Plant, or accept a retraining package and find a new path entirely. The Ontario government partnered with Ford to open a dedicated employment counseling and training center specifically for WCP workers and other Ford employees affected by the restructuring. The center offered job search assistance, vocational and educational counseling, financial planning guidance, and personal support for workers dealing with the psychological weight of job loss. It was a genuine effort, more comprehensive than many communities receive when a major employer exits. And it reflected both the political significance of Windsor as an auto industry city and the scale of what was being lost. But no severance package makes a foundry worker into something other than a foundry worker overnight. The skills built over 20 or 30 years in a casting plant, the knowledge of how molten iron behaves, how molds are set, how tolerances are held in extreme heat, do not transfer cleanly to other industries. Some workers made the transition successfully. Others found that the retraining programs led to jobs that paid less, demanded different things from their bodies, and did not carry the same weight of identity that foundry work had carried. Tom McWilliams understood this better than most. McWilliams was Windsor Casting Plant's manufacturing manager, a 24-year Ford veteran, 17 of those years spent at WCP. He had come up through the plant during the award years, had been part of the push toward Q1, had watched the ISO certifications accumulate and the safety record improve. He knew the foundry not as an abstraction, but as a physical place with a specific smell, a specific sound, specific people at specific machines at specific times of day. In the final months, McWilliams kept the plant running to the standard it had always maintained. There was no coasting, no quiet relaxation of the expectations that had defined WCP's operating culture. Adrian Vito, Ford of Canada's Windsor site manager, would later note publicly that the workers at Windsor Casting Plant had achieved outstanding productivity levels with consistently high quality right down to the last engine block produced. It was not a corporate formality. The record supported it. The community outside the plant was less composed. On the Sunday before the scheduled closure date, Windsor held a rally. Workers, family members, union representatives, and community supporters gathered to protest the loss of manufacturing jobs. Not just at WCP, but across the broader Windsor-Essex automotive ecosystem that had been shedding employment for years. Windsor sat directly across the Detroit River from a city that was itself in the middle of a manufacturing collapse. And the people who gathered that Sunday understood with unusual clarity what deindustrialization looked like when it arrived in full. They were not wrong to be angry. They were not wrong to demonstrate. But the rally changed nothing. May 29, 2007 arrived. The morning shift came in. The furnaces ran. The last engine block was cast, cooled, and moved down the line. The last crankshaft was finished. Somewhere in the sequence of final production, a worker who had spent years pouring iron in that building watched a component come off a machine and knew, because he had been counting, that it was the last one. No ceremony had been planned for the floor. The work ended the way it had always been done, with precision, with professionalism, and without drama. The people at Windsor Casting Plant had never needed ceremony to validate what they did. The product validated it. At the end of the shift, the furnaces were shut down. After 73 years, 1 month, and 20 days of continuous operation, through war and recession, through oil crises and market shifts, through closures and reopenings, through awards and restructurings and the slow erosion of everything the foundry had been built to support, Windsor Casting Plant went dark. 500 workers walked out of the building for the last time. The iron had stopped flowing. Ford's official explanation for closing Windsor Casting Plant was clean and corporate and technically accurate. The company had decided to move away from in-house casting operations. It needed to focus on its core business. The economics of maintaining proprietary foundries in high-cost North American urban locations no longer made sense in a global supply chain where specialized casting suppliers could deliver equivalent components at lower cost. It was a business decision. Rational. Defensible. The kind of decision that looks straightforward on a spreadsheet and catastrophic on a street. But the full meaning of what Ford decided in 2006 goes considerably deeper than a line item in a restructuring plan. To understand it, you have to understand what vertical integration actually meant to the North American auto industry, and what abandoning it actually cost. For most of the 20th century, the great automakers operated on a principle that Henry Ford himself had taken to its logical extreme. If you want to control quality, control the entire supply chain. Ford's River Rouge complex in Dearborn, Michigan, begun in the 1920s, was the physical embodiment of this philosophy. Iron ore came in by ship. Steel was produced on-site. Glass was manufactured on-site. The finished vehicle rolled off the end of the line and into a rail car. Ford owned every step. Ford controlled every variable. Nothing that went into a Ford vehicle was made by someone Ford did not own or directly supervise. Windsor Casting Plant was part of that legacy. Not at the scale of River Rouge, but in the same tradition. A Ford-owned facility producing Ford components for Ford engines that would go into Ford vehicles. The iron that came out of WCP's furnaces had a chain of custody that ran directly from extraction to finished product without passing through an external supplier's hands. That chain of custody was worth something, not just operationally, but philosophically. When Ford decided to exit casting, it was not merely closing 2 foundries. It was making a declaration about what kind of company it intended to be going forward. It was saying, we are no longer a manufacturer in the full sense of that word. We are an assembler. We are a designer. We are a brand. The components that constitute the physical reality of our products will increasingly be made by other people, in other places, under other flags. The companies that took over casting work from Ford did not operate out of downtown Windsor. They operated in lower-cost environments, facilities in the American South, in Mexico, and increasingly in Asia, where land was cheaper, labor costs were lower, and environmental and safety regulations were less demanding. The savings were real. The transfer of economic activity was also real. And the communities that had built their identities around being part of the Ford supply chain were left to absorb the difference. Windsor was not alone in this. Industrial Midwest and Southern Ontario were experiencing the same structural shift simultaneously, as one company after another concluded that vertical integration was a liability and outsourcing was the future. The logic was always the same. The consequences were always the same. The spreadsheets always looked better. The cities always looked worse. What made Windsor's situation carry a particular weight was the specific history of the relationship. This was not a community that had been assigned a Ford plant by geography or economic incentive. Windsor had been the birthplace of Ford in Canada. Gordon MacGregor and Henry Ford had made a deal in 1904 that turned a wagon factory into the foundation of the Canadian auto industry. The workers who poured iron at WCP were in many cases the grandchildren and great-grandchildren of the people who had built Ford City from scratch. The relationship was not transactional, it was generational. And the Windsor V8 was the most visible symbol of that relationship. Here is the irony that sits at the center of this story. After Windsor Casting Plant closed, after the furnaces went dark and the building was demolished and the land was cleared, the Windsor V8 engine did not disappear. The name survived. The engine continued to be produced. The Windsor designation remained in use in the automotive enthusiast community, carried forward by collectors and restorers and mechanics who had spent decades working on the engines that WCP had helped create. The name of a city remained on an engine. The city no longer benefited from it. That is not a metaphor. That is the literal outcome of the decision Ford made in 2006. The brand equity accumulated by 7 decades of casting work in Windsor, Ontario, the reputation built by the workers who earned Q1 and ISO 14001 and the Pollution Prevention Award, was retained by the company. The economic activity that had sustained the community was transferred elsewhere. Ford kept the name, Windsor lost the jobs. There is a question worth sitting with here, not as an accusation, but as a genuine inquiry into the nature of modern industrial capitalism. When a company decides that it no longer needs to make the fundamental physical components of its own product, what does it mean to say that the company makes that product? When Ford stopped casting its own engine blocks and crankshafts, in what meaningful sense was Ford still manufacturing engines? The answer that corporate strategists would give is that Ford's value lies in design, engineering, brand management, and final assembly. That these are the high-value activities, and that casting iron is a commodity function that any competent supplier can perform. And there is something to that argument. Design and engineering do carry significant value. Brand management does matter. But there is also something lost in the translation. The worker who spent 30 years at Windsor Casting Plant knew things about iron that no corporate strategy document can capture. He knew how the metal behaved at different temperatures. He knew which variables in the casting process affected the structural integrity of the finished component. He knew, in the wordless way that expertise accumulates through repetition, where the process was vulnerable and how to catch the problem before it became a defect. That knowledge lived in his hands and his memory. It did not live in a supplier contract. When Windsor Casting Plant closed, that knowledge left the Ford system. Some of it retired, some of it dispersed into other industries. Very little of it was captured and transferred. In the accounting of the way forward, it did not appear as a cost. It was invisible. But it was real. And Windsor, the city, the community, the families who had built their lives around the foundry and the engine plants and the industrial ecosystem that Ford had anchored for a century, felt its absence in ways that no severance package and no retraining program fully addressed. The decision to outsource casting was, on its own terms, rational. What it cost is a different calculation entirely. In most stories about industrial closure, the building remains. It stands empty, windows broken, roof sagging, weeds pushing through the concrete. But it stands. It becomes a landmark of absence, a physical monument to what used to happen inside it. People drive past and point. Photographers document the decay. Urban explorers move through the silence with flashlights, finding in the wreckage some residue of the activity that once filled it. The building becomes a container for memory, a place where grief can locate itself in space. Windsor Casting Plant did not get that. In 2008, less than a year after the last engine block rolled off the line, the 500,000 square foot foundry was demolished. The building that had stood in downtown Windsor since 1934, that had survived the Depression, the Second World War, the oil crises, the 1980 shutdown, and 73 years of continuous industrial operation, was taken down in a matter of weeks. The rubble was cleared. The land was leveled. Where the foundry had stood, there was nothing. No ruin, no artifact. No structure for memory to attach itself to. Just ground. For the workers who had spent their careers inside that building, the demolition carried a particular cruelty. The closure had been hard enough, but closure leaves a building. Demolition erases the evidence. It removes the physical proof that the work ever happened, that the furnaces ever burned, that the crankshafts ever moved, that 500 people ever showed up every morning and made something real out of raw iron. Windsor had lost the foundry twice, once when it closed and once when it disappeared. The contrast with what happened next door made the erasure harder to absorb. Essex Engine Plant, the Ford facility that had been built in 1981 to produce the Essex V6 engine, and that had also been named for closure under The Way Forward, did not disappear. When Ford announced in 2006 that Essex would close, it closed. The workers were laid off. The machinery went quiet. But the building remained standing, and the story did not end there. In 2008, the federal government of Canada committed 80 million Canadian dollars over 5 years to support the reopening of Essex Engine Plant. The province of Ontario added $16.8 million. In February 2010, less than 3 years after Windsor Casting Plant had been demolished, Essex Engine Plant reopened. It was retooled to produce the new 5.0-liter version of the Ford modular engine, the Coyote V8 that would go on to power the Mustang and the F-150, and become one of the most celebrated Ford engines of the modern era. Ontario then committed a further $81 million to the plant in 2010. Ford kept Essex. Ford demolished WCP. The distinction was not arbitrary. Essex was producing a current, high-demand engine for vehicles that were central to Ford's going-forward product strategy. WCP had been producing castings for engines that Ford was phasing out, the 4.2-liter V6 and the legacy V8 configurations that were being superseded by newer designs. The strategic logic was real. The economic rationale was defensible. But for Windsor, watching Essex reopen with nearly $100 million in government support while the foundry site sat empty and leveled, the message was difficult to misread. Some plants were worth saving, others were worth erasing, and the community did not always get to choose which category its plants fell into. The human arithmetic of what happened to Windsor's auto workforce in the years surrounding WCP's closure is stark. In the year 2000, Windsor and the surrounding Essex County region had approximately 6,300 Ford workers employed across 6 engine and engine parts plants. By 2014, that number had fallen to approximately 1,400 workers at 2 remaining facilities, Essex Engine Plant and Windsor Engine Plant. That is a reduction of nearly 78% in Ford employment in the region over 14 years. Nearly 5 out of every 6 Ford jobs in Windsor were gone. Windsor Casting Plant's 500 jobs were a fraction of that total loss. But they were among the first to go, and their disappearance set a tone. Each subsequent closure, and there were several, landed in a community that had already absorbed one round of devastation and had not yet fully recovered from it. In March 2012, Ford closed the Windsor aluminum plant, which had been producing Duratec engine blocks. Another closure, another set of layoffs, another round of severance packages and retraining programs and employment counseling centers. The workers who had left Windsor Casting Plant in 2007 had been told, and many had genuinely believed that the broader Windsor auto ecosystem would absorb them, that the transfers to Oakville and St. Thomas would hold, that the retraining programs would open new doors, that the community would find its footing. Some of that happened. The Oakville Assembly Complex continued to operate. St. Thomas continued to produce Crown Victorias until 2011, when it too closed. But the footing was never fully recovered. The workers who had transferred found themselves in plants that were themselves subject to restructuring pressures. The workers who had retrained found industries that did not always value what they brought. The workers who had retired found that early retirement in a community experiencing economic contraction had consequences that the severance calculations had not fully anticipated. In property values, in local services, in the slow diminishment of the commercial activity that a healthy industrial workforce sustains. And the younger workers, the ones who had expected to follow their parents and grandparents into the foundry, the ones for whom WCP had represented not just employment, but a continuation of a family and community tradition, found that the path had been closed before they could walk it. There's a category of loss that does not appear in economic impact studies. It is the loss of expectation, the loss of the assumption that the future will resemble the past in its basic structure, that there will be a plant, that there will be a job, that showing up and doing the work will be enough. Windsor Casting Plant had sustained that expectation for 3 generations of Windsor families. When the building came down in 2008, the expectation came down with it. What replaced it was uncertainty. And uncertainty in an industrial community that had never been built for uncertainty is its own kind of demolition. Windsor is still a Ford city. That is not a nostalgic claim. It is a current fact. In July 2024, Ford Motor Company announced a $3 billion investment in its Ontario operations, with the centerpiece being a retooling of the Oakville Assembly Complex to produce the next generation of F-Series Super Duty trucks beginning in 2026. As part of that investment, Ford committed to adding approximately 150 jobs at the Windsor engine facilities, Essex Engine Plant, and Windsor Engine Plant, to support increased V8 production, including new lines for the 6.8-liter and 7.3-liter engines destined for Ford's commercial truck customers. The announcement was welcomed. Unifor's Auto Council chair called it incredible news. Workers who had spent years watching the Windsor auto workforce contract were cautiously optimistic. The snowball effect, as one union representative put it, if Oakville gets bigger, Windsor gets bigger. It was a genuine reason for encouragement. And yet, the Windsor that will benefit from that 2024 investment is a fundamentally different place from the Windsor that built the foundry in 1934. The 150 jobs coming to the engine facilities are not 500 foundry jobs. The workers who will fill them will be assembling engines from components manufactured elsewhere, cast by suppliers in facilities that Ford does not own, in locations that Ford chose precisely because they are not downtown Windsor, Ontario. The chain that once ran from raw iron to finished crankshaft inside a single postal code no longer exists. It has been distributed across a global supply network that is efficient and cost-effective and utterly invisible to the people who buy the vehicles at the end of it. Essex Engine Plant today produces the 5.0-liter Coyote V8, the engine that powers the Mustang and the F-150, the engine that automotive enthusiasts regard as one of the best Ford has built in decades. It is genuinely excellent work, done by skilled people in a facility that was saved from closure by nearly $100 million in government investment. Windsor still makes engines. Windsor should be proud of that. But Windsor no longer casts iron. The foundry work, the elemental, brutal, skilled work of pouring molten metal into molds and pulling out the structural core of an engine, left in 2007 and did not come back. The suppliers who took over that work do not carry Windsor's name. The components they produce do not carry Windsor's history. The economic relationship between Ford and Windsor has been redefined. Windsor is now a place where Ford assembles and manufactures, but no longer a place where Ford makes the fundamental, physical building blocks of its engines from scratch. That redefinition has a name in economic geography. It is called the hollowing out of industrial capacity. And it is not unique to Windsor. It is the story of the entire Great Lakes manufacturing corridor over the past 40 years, told one plant closure at a time, one community at a time, one generation of industrial workers at a time. What Windsor Casting Plant left behind is harder to quantify than a job count or a production number. It left behind a generation of workers whose expertise in iron casting, expertise that had been refined over decades, recognized with international certifications, and validated by Ford's own quality auditors, had no place to go. Some of that expertise retired. Some of it dispersed. None of it was replaced within the Windsor economy, because the work that required it no longer existed there. It left behind a physical void. Not just the empty lot where the foundry stood, but the absence of the entire ecosystem that a foundry sustains. The suppliers who delivered raw materials to WCP, the maintenance contractors who serviced its equipment, the small businesses along Driard Road that had depended on foundry workers spending their paychecks in the neighborhood. Industrial ecosystems are not simply collections of jobs. They are webs of economic interdependence. And when the anchor institution disappears, the web does not merely shrink. It restructures around a new and smaller center. It left behind a question about identity that Windsor has never fully resolved. Windsor built its sense of itself on the idea that it made things. Real things. Heavy things. Things that required heat and skill and physical effort and precision. The foundry was not the only expression of that identity. The engine plants, the assembly operations, the tool and die shops, the supplier network, all of it contributed. But the foundry was the most elemental expression of it. It was the place where raw material became component, where iron became engine, where the most basic act of industrial manufacturing happened every day, in a building that smelled of hot metal and echoed with the sound of machinery that had no patience for abstraction. When that building came down, something in Windsor's understanding of itself came down with it. The Windsor V8 still exists as a designation. Collectors restore cars powered by engines that carry the Windsor name. Enthusiasts discuss displacement figures and horsepower ratings and the particular character of an engine family that defined North American performance driving for several decades. On forums and at car shows and in garages across the continent, the Windsor V8 is remembered with genuine affection. The city that named it is less often remembered in those conversations. That asymmetry between the persistence of the name and the diminishment of the place is perhaps the most honest summary of what happened to Windsor Casting Plant and to the community it anchored. Ford retained the equity. Windsor absorbed the cost. The arrangement was legal, rational, and consistent with how global industrial capitalism has always operated. It was also, for the people who lived it, a particular kind of loss that resists easy categorization. Not failure. The foundry did not fail. It was excellent at what it did, and the record proves it. Not obsolescence exactly. The work of casting engine components did not disappear. It moved. Something closer to abandonment. The slow, strategic economically justified withdrawal of a commitment that 3 generations of Windsor families had built their lives around, executed with severance packages and retraining programs and press releases about focusing on core operations, leaving behind a community that was told it had been treated fairly and was left to decide for itself whether that was true. Tom McWilliams, the manufacturing manager who spent 17 years at WCP and watched the last shift end, said it plainly in the final days. It is simply the right thing to do in a tough situation. He was talking about the severance packages, about Ford's obligation to its workers. But the phrase carries further than he may have intended. In a tough situation, you do the right thing. You honor your obligations. You close the books as cleanly as you can. And then you move on. Because the business requires it. Because the market demands it. Because the spreadsheet has already told you what comes next. The foundry is gone. The ground where it stood has been cleared and repurposed. The iron it poured has long since been machined into engines, installed in vehicles, driven across decades of roads, and eventually scrapped. Returned, in the end, to the same raw material it started as. Nothing is wasted. Everything moves on. But every time a Windsor V8 engine fires, in a restored Mustang on a summer highway, in a vintage Thunderbird turning into a showground, in the memory of anyone who ever stood on a foundry floor and watched molten iron take the shape of something that would outlast the hands that made it, there is a city in that sound. A city on a river. A foundry on a lot. Workers who showed up, did the work, and were told it was enough. It was enough. It just was not enough to save them.